As already noted, probably the most popular and widely used GI tool available in Mental Ray at this moment in time is Final Gather. Originally added to the renderer as a finisher for the photon-based system, Final Gather has since moved on to become a fully fledged GI tool in its own right. Time in this video then to put Final Gather to the test and see how it performs in a scene that presents quite a challenge to it. Here we have an interior with just a single window or opening to the outside environment where we are using the physical sun and sky for lighting. These are providing the only source of illumination for the interior, thereby making it quite hard for Final Gather to calculate a clean and even GI solution. To see just how difficult this will be, let's take a render of the interior with only direct lighting enabled. As you can see, not a lot of direct light for Final Gather to work with at all. Now we could significantly improve the level of direct lighting in the scene by making use of Mental Ray's native IBL render mode, as opposed to creating skylight illumination using Final Gather as we do in the sun and sky system. The reasons for not doing this though are twofold. Firstly, we do want to focus here on using Final Gather and its controls in order to show just what it can and cannot do in a challenging situation such as this. Secondly, using native IBL for interior renders does itself introduce a whole new set of problems in terms of the noise levels it adds to the scene. Even for the direct light coming from native IBL rendering, this relatively small window opening presents quite a light penetration challenge, meaning that without pretty decent and so slow quality settings in place, we could actually end up creating quite a lot of ugly shadow noise in the scene. For these reasons then, we're going to stick with what we already have in place and see what Final Gather can do with the limited amount of direct light available to it. As we will probably want to compare what we have here with subsequent renders, let's first of all go ahead and save our image by means of the render view controls. To work with the Final Gather system, we will of course need to be inside the indirect lighting tab of the render settings window, where we first of all need to put a check in the final gathering option in order to enable it. Now we could take a render at this point and we would certainly see a difference in scene lighting, but to be honest, what we get would look fairly rough, simply because by default Final Gather has no extra bounces of light enabled, and in this environment bounce light is most certainly going to be required, especially if a natural looking lighting solution is what we are trying to create. For the most part, depending of course on the amount of direct light coming into an environment, a diffuse bounces value of between 3 and 5 for Final Gather tends to yield pretty good results. Let's straight away plug in a high value of 5 then, and with everything else set as per defaults, see what a render reveals to us. Well, straight away we can see that we have massively improved illumination levels in the environment. In fact, given that the scene has photographic exposure enabled, I would say that what we are seeing here, given the settings in use, is a fairly expected look in terms of illumination levels. Scrubbing to compare the two renders certainly shows that we're definitely heading in the right direction. The default Final Gather quality settings being used here though are quite clearly leaving us with a number of issues that need tackling, the most obvious of which is the large-scale noise or splotching that we are seeing. Clearly we will have to do some tweaking here in order to improve the Final Gather solution. Now, as you would perhaps expect in a renderer of Mental Ray's quality, the Final Gather system gives us the ability to improve matters in a number of ways. So as to avoid high render times though, I personally prefer to work with as low a point density value as possible and then work at steadily increasing the accuracy or number of hemispherical rays being used to sample illumination levels in the environment. A point density value of 0.5 should work well here, along with an accuracy setting that produces around about 500 rays per Final Gather sample point. This should yield a significant increase in quality without adding anything too nasty in the way of increased render times. Of course, we do need to be aware that increases on any of these two values can and will impact our render times noticeably. The trick is to keep those times at an acceptable level for the production that we are currently working on. That having been said then, let's again save what we have and take another render. Well, things are certainly improving, but we obviously need to find some way of further reducing the large splotches that we see here. preferably without adding anything more to our already increased render times. To smooth things out a little then, we will probably want to blend or interpolate more final gather points than is currently the case, although we do need to be aware that we can lose fine detail in the scene if we go too far with this. A point interpolation value of 25 should work well in this particular scene. Again, let's save what we have and take another render. Well, we have once again taken a significant step forward in terms of the quality of our lighting solution, and we have added only a few extra seconds to our render time. The problem, however, if we're being completely honest, is that things still aren't looking tremendously good. We still see lots of noise or splotching in the scene. Now, we could continue to increase the sampling levels we are working with here and produce an increasingly refined solution. The first problem with that approach would be that our render times would climb considerably higher than they already are. The second would be that we would still avoid tackling this quality issue at its source, which is exactly what we will do in our next video as we take a look at using a mental ray physical sky portal to help improve our final gather sampling. Having already spent some time in this chapter learning about and then making use of Mental Ray's Final Gather engine, one thing we have perhaps come to realise is that working with Final Gather on a daylight interior scene, such as the one that we have here, isn't perhaps quite as simple or straightforward a process as we may have thought. In fact, unless we're working with a scene that has lots of window openings, preferably big ones, that really expose the interior space to the daylight environment outside, we can oftentimes struggle to create a really clean and usable lighting solution from it, which means we're going to need a little bit of help from someone. Enter the MIA Portal Light, a mental ray light type that can be used to good effect as a straightforward, physically correct area light, but that was in fact introduced into Mental Ray to help solve the very problem we have run into here. You may recall in our overview of Final Gather or irradiance mapping that we outlined the two-phase sampling process that Mental Ray goes through in order to create a GI solution with this engine. Phase 1 being placement of initial Final Gather points in the scene, and Phase 2 being the hemispherical rays that are shot from each of those Final Gather points in order to evaluate the level of illumination required for the final render. Well, the problem that Final Gather is having here is that those secondary rays are sampling the environment in a very uniform or even manner, meaning that only a small percentage of them will be finding their way to either the window opening itself or to the direct sunlight being cast onto the floor. With the rest of the environment, as we have already seen, in complete darkness as far as direct light is concerned, it is probably safe to say that the majority of first generation rays here are sampling pure black, which when added to the blended or interpolated Final Gather mix is causing the noise or splotching that we are seeing. Enter, as we say, the MIA Portal Light. To create one of these, we will first of all need to have a standard Maya area light available in our scene. To add one, let's switch to a foreview in the panel layouts, and then in the bottom right panel, frame up on our window opening using the orthographic right view option. We need to do this because in order to be effective as a sky portal, the area light needs to cover, from the rendering camera's point of view, any openings to the outdoor environment as thoroughly as possible. The reason being that Mental Ray is going to bias or point our Final Gather accuracy rays toward this sky portal, essentially giving the render engine a great big signpost that says, this is where the light is coming from, sample more from here. From the rendering shelf then, let's click to create an area light in the scene and then use the scale tool to make it nice and visible in the viewport. As this has been created at pretty much the centre of our room, we will need to drag it back in either the top or front views in order to position it just outside of the room geometry. We will then need to rotate it 90 degrees on the y-axis in order to have it point into the room, which is extremely important. Then of course we can position and scale it using the orthographic right view for accuracy. With the light still selected, let's come over to the attribute editor and in the Mental Ray and area light rollouts, put a check in both the use light shape and visible options. Scrolling down a little way to the custom shaders rollout, let's also click on the suppress or Maya shaders option and then in the light shader field, add an MIA Portal Light. In the controls for the portal light itself, the first thing we want to do is check that we have shadows disabled. This will make a big difference to the overall calculation times for the final gather solution. Granted, we would get much stronger occlusion in the scene with shadows enabled, but in this instance it probably makes more sense for us to create either a custom ambient occlusion pass or use the MIA Material X's ambient occlusion functionality in order to save on calculation time. Of course, if our current render times are perfectly acceptable to us and we don't mind adding a little bit to them, we could give portal light shadows a try. Although in order to get a decent solution using them, we would probably need to set our final gather quality settings here a little bit higher than we currently have them, and then of course allow for the extra render time this will incur. With the portal setup complete then, let's go ahead and add that material based occlusion we just mentioned by opening up the Hypershade editor, and for each of the MIA materials that we have here, come down to the ambient occlusion rollout, put a check in the use ambient occlusion option, and then set the distance value to something suitable. Around about 25 centimeters should work well here. As this material trick adds very little to render times, it is a valid method for adding at least a bit extra in terms of occlusion shadows to the scene, especially so if final gather calculation and overall render times are already high. Finally, as this light source will, given that it has shadows disabled, introduce quite a bit of extra illumination into the room, let's switch back to a single perspective view, jump to our rendering camera, and then tweak our photographic exposure, setting the shutter speed to a value of 16. All that remains now is to take another render and compare. What we get is quite a significant improvement over our initial final gather solution, with much more light bouncing around the environment and a much reduced level of noise in the scene. Having spent some time with final gather then, let's move on to our next exercise where we can start to take a look at Mental Ray's original global illumination toolset, this of course being photon mapping. Whilst Final Gather may today be the most widely used of Mental Ray's GI options, it is the system that we will look at here, photon mapping, that has been available in Mental Ray the longest. In fact, although Final Gather is today used as a complete GI solution in its own right, it was initially introduced as a tool to help smooth out photon map renders. Now, photon mapping, unlike Final Gather, is not a view dependent, but is rather a scene dependent GI technique. This is because photons are shot or traced not from the rendering camera in a scene, but from the light sources themselves. This means that once a photon solution has been calculated, it can be saved to disk and the rendering camera moved anywhere inside the environment without causing any problem at all for the GI solution at render time. Again, let's walk through the basics of how a photon GI solution is created, just so that we are clear on how the technology is working. The first thing we of course need in a scene is a photon generating light source. To set our light up for this, we need on our light shape node to be in the Mental Ray and Caustic and Global Illumination rollout, where we can make certain that the Emit Photons option is enabled. Once photon mapping itself is then turned on inside the Indirect Lighting tab of the Render Settings dialog, we're ready to generate a photon mapped GI solution. When a render is initialized now, our light source will emit a user-specified number of photons, with the final number being controlled on the light source itself by means of the global illumination photons value. With only a single light source in the scene, we are by default set up to emit a total of 10,000 photons. Now, whilst 10,000 of anything may sound like quite a high number, in terms of photons used to create a GI solution, this is in fact a very low number. Oftentimes, a good photon solution can use emitted photons that number into the millions, which is fine as photon calculations are extremely fast in Mental Ray. Once a photon leaves the light source, it will trace its way through the 3D environment, travelling in a straight line along the vector on which it was emitted, until that is, it encounters a geometric object in the scene, at which point it can, in simplistic terms, do one of three things as controlled by the material properties of the surface it strikes. It can be reflected or bounced and so continue travelling along another vector in the scene. It can be transmitted through the object, as would be the case with materials such as glass, or it can be absorbed, as would happen completely with a totally matte black surface. Now in reality, these processes are not mutually exclusive. In other words, most surface types will allow for two or more of these interactions to take place at any given time and to varying degrees. With each new interaction, a photon will lose a portion of the light energy that it is carrying, unless of course we are bouncing our light off complete mirror surfaces. Once a photon reaches the end of the line, as it were, so let's say in this instance it reaches the maximum number of reflections allowed by the photon trace depth settings, well, at that point, it, along with all of the surface material information that it has picked up along the way, gets stored in a photon map, which is a 3D data structure or point cloud. Mental Ray then gathers information from groups of photons in the map according to either the default or a user-specified radius value. It does this in order to combine and then average the colour information they carry and so create a global illumination lighting sample. Once this process is complete for all of the available photons in the map, the image rendering phase is triggered and we get to see a render created inside Maya's render view window. Now by default, the radius for the averaging that takes place here is set at 1/10 of the overall scene size, which, whilst fine in some cases, can oftentimes cause a photon solution to be a little too soft and so miss out on small details in the scene. This default can be overridden by means of the global radius control. As with most of the photon mapping options available, the radius required in order to produce a good-looking GI solution will vary considerably from scene to scene. Accurate real-world scale will definitely be our friend when it comes to tuning this centimetre-based value. Now that we have the basics of photon mapping behaviour in mind then, let's, as we did with Final Gather, move back into our interior test scene and create a photon GI solution for it. Having already seen the lighting solution produced for our test interior using the Final Gather engine, time now in this first of two videos to put Mental Ray's original global illumination engine, photon mapping, to work and see what kind of lighting solution can be produced using it. Enabling photons, as with Final Gather, is handled through the indirect lighting tab of the render settings dialog. In here we have a dedicated global illumination rollout where we can enable the GI system by putting a check in the fairly obvious global illumination box. As with the Final Gather system, this brings plenty of options to life, all of which give us the ability to tweak and refine our photon mapping solution. Not that the number of controls needs be cause for concern, however, as we, typically speaking, only need to use a handful of them on anything like a regular basis when working, that is, with what I will call fairly typical lighting setups. Now, if you have already worked through the Final Gather exercises in this chapter, you will be well aware that lighting in our scene here is being provided by a physical sun and sky system. This means that in order to make efficient use of emitted photons, we're going to want to make a little tweak to our lighting setup, specifically that of our sun. To do so, let's select the sun direction node from the outliner and then over in the attribute editor, make certain that our light source is set up to emit photons by, on the light shape node, coming down to the Mental Ray and then caustic and global illumination rollouts and putting a check in the emit photons box. Then in the physical sun tab, we also want to make certain that we put a check in the automatic photon energy option. This will cause the energy and colour values for the sun photons to be automatically and correctly calculated, which, typically speaking, is the way in which we will want things to work. If I go ahead and hit the render button now, what we see is a very quick photon emission calculation down in the bottom left of the Maya UI, after which a GI render starts. This, once completed, gives us a render that is very comparable in terms of light levels and quality to our initial Final Gather setup from the previous exercise. The big difference here, of course, is that this photon-based solution has rendered in a fraction of the time. Indeed, the ability to quickly get light into even hard-to-reach spaces and then bounce it efficiently around that environment is exactly what photons in Mental Ray are very good at. Now, although things are so far looking okay using the default GI photon settings, we can certainly optimize things a little in order to get an even better lighting solution from them. To do that, let's come back to the global illumination rollout in the render settings window and set a maximum sampling radius of about 10 centimeters. This option gives us the ability to manually specify the sampling area or size of each of the generated photons. Bigger values will produce a softer, less detailed solution, while smaller numbers give photons the ability to pick out smaller geometry details in the scene. With that said, we can save what we have in the render view window and take another render. What we now see in the rendered image are the sampling results of individual photons in the scene, which of course are no longer being automatically sized and blended together. Now whilst the size setting looks fairly decent here in terms of our photons being able to pick out scene detail, clearly a number of photons being generated is nowhere near enough to give us good coverage of our interior space. Before we go ahead and start to increase our photon count though, let's take a look for a moment or two at our photon tracing controls found in the rollout of the same name. The reflection option seen here performs basically the same function as the diffuse bounces control in the final gather engine. That is, it determines how many times a photon coming into the environment can reflect or bounce off geometry in the scene. The energy value that each particular photon is carrying will of course determine how bright a photon is with each of those subsequent bounces. The refraction control, in contrast, determines how many geometric surfaces in the scene a photon can refract or pass through, again with the energy value determining how bright it will be with each of those refractions. Which of these two routes a photon takes will depend entirely on the contact surface's material setup. As we have no refractive materials currently at work in the scene, this second value isn't really going to come into play here. So let's set our maximum depth value to 50, max reflections to 45, ensuring lots of diffuse bounces, and for now let's leave refractions at a low value of just 5. What this means is that we're now ready in our next video to take a look at increasing the number of photons being pumped into our environment, as clearly the current value of 10,000 coming from our direct light source is nowhere near enough to create an even look to our GI lighting solution. With a basic photon solution in place then, and with our photon trace depth settings giving us plenty of diffuse bounces in the scene, what we need to do now is take a look at the number of photons being emitted by our light and, given the sparseness of photons currently showing up in our render, increase that amount by quite a bit. As we have only one photon emitting light in the scene at this moment in time, let's go ahead and select that in the outliner, and then in the attribute editor's caustic and global illumination rollout, make use of the localized global illumination photons value. Let's set this to something around about 10 million emitted photons in the scene by adding 3 zeros to the number that we see here. As a side note, if the global illumination photons value is greyed out when we come to it, all we need to do, given that this is just a refresh glitch, is turn the attribute editor off and then on again, and the numeric field should come to life. Now don't worry about the fact that the number we have entered here is an extremely high value. Photons can calculate very quickly indeed inside Mental Ray, and so using numbers that run into the millions is a pretty common thing to do in order to get a good solution from them, especially so in scenes that have more visual complexity than the one that we are using here. Of course, if it is that we are currently working on a computer that has fairly low processor and or memory specifications, then we may want to start with a value that is a little more sensible, say something around about 50 to 75,000, and then slowly work our way up from there. That having been said, there is something we can do to help both optimize and speed up the photon calculation phase, which is to jump into the physical sun tab in the attribute editor and set up an emission zone for the sun by means of the photon bounding box controls, outside of which no photons will be generated. Now the values that work here will of course vary greatly from scene to scene, but with our window being such a small opening through which we need our photons to pass, a value of 300 in each of the max fields here can potentially help cut our photon emission times by more than half. With that done then, let's take a render and see what we get. Well, what we have is a render that still completes within a very reasonable time frame, especially so given the number of photons being used here, and one that certainly displays a much more even and detailed look to the lighting solution than we were getting at the end of our previous exercise. To improve, or perhaps I should more accurately say to smooth the lighting solution out a little more, we may in the render settings dialog want to add a very specific blending radius to the photon samples by applying a fairly large merge distance to them, keeping in mind of course that doing so will soften the solution at least a little, thereby potentially causing us to miss detail in the scene. Now unfortunately I do have a confession to make here, which is that no matter how high we go with our photon count, within usable production limits that is, it is highly unlikely that we are ever going to get a really clean, smooth GI solution using just the photon mapping engine alone. As we have already mentioned, its strength is getting light into difficult to reach spaces and then efficiently bouncing that light around, which is why we come back to Final Gather and the reason for its original inclusion in the Mental Ray renderer, which, as we've noted, was to function as a smoothing engine to help iron out the kinks in a photon mapping solution. In our next video then, we're going to take a look at how we can combine these two GI engines and essentially create a best of both worlds GI lighting scenario. So far in this chapter, we have seen what both Final Gather and photon mapping can do individually as regards creating a GI lighting solution for our interior test scene. What we haven't taken a look at though is what both of them combined can produce, which is exactly what we will do in this video. Indeed, the start scene we're working with here is essentially a straight continuation from our previous photon mapping exercise, with all of the same photon options already in place. We have though added our sky portal to the scene so as to be certain that Final Gather is getting all the help it needs in order to produce as fast and high quality a solution as possible. We have also tweaked our exposure settings a little so as to compensate for the addition of that portal light. With our scene ready to go then, let's quickly pull up the render view window and just remind ourselves of the solutions that we have already created. Here we have renders of the finished Final Gather and photon mapping solutions taken from our previous exercises. Both are considerably different in terms of general lighting, GI quality, and very importantly, time taken to complete. Well, let's see what we can produce using the two GI engines combined by, in the render settings dialog, enabling Final Gather for this scene and then taking another render. What we get is a fairly decent image, but with just a little bit of tweaking, I think we can considerably improve the speed of what we are getting here without affecting the quality of the finished lighting solution. The first thing we can go ahead and do then is drastically reduce the number of GI photons currently being used, as all we really need to do is give the Final Gather system a decent representation of scene illumination as opposed to trying to create a smooth final rendered solution from the photons. Let's select our sun direction node in the outliner then and set the number of emitted photons on the direct light to a greatly reduced value of just 500,000. Next, as Final Gather with photons in the scene calculates much more quickly than when doing all of the work by itself, we can improve detail and occlusion shadows in the scene by actually increasing our Final Gather settings a little. So 0.75 for the Final Gather points value, 700 for the accuracy or hemispherical rays, and we can set the number of Final Gather points to blend between at around about 25. Now, although not strictly necessary, one thing we can do for visual clarity here is set the diffuse bounces value to 0, as this option no longer works once photon mapping has been enabled in the scene. This, as we have noted a number of times, is because photons are much more adept at efficiently bouncing light around an environment, and so that particular task is left to them. With everything in place then, let's take a final render and see what we have. Well, the end result is, in my opinion, a higher quality render than the Final Gather only solution that we looked at earlier, which for me was clearly the better of those two solutions produced. Naturally, the values we have used here and the times taken to complete the renders are all very much scene and machine specific, meaning as we come to work on our own difficult to light spaces, we're going to have to spend some time testing out values and looking for the numbers that work well with our particular scene. Once we do though, we will find, as we did here, that giving the Final Gather engine a helping hand by means of the photon mapping system can certainly help save lots of time from a rendering perspective, and so give us the opportunity to crank up our overall quality settings without, as we say, having to worry overly much about the render times we may incur. Having seen then how both final gather and photon mapping can be used together to extremely good effect, let's take a look now at the ability we have when using Mental Ray's GI systems to save, load and reuse pre-calculated GI solutions. We are again continuing on in our scene from where we left the previous exercise, with both final gather and photon mapping enabled and producing a fairly decent end result in a fairly decent time frame, using what most experienced Mental Ray users would probably describe as around about mid-range settings. For artists needing to produce multi-frame renders from a scene though, the good news is that we can lower render times here even further by, as we say, saving and then reusing pre-calculated GI solutions. Now with render times already fairly low here, that may not sound like such an important feat to accomplish, but remember this is an almost untextured scene. As soon as we start adding high quality, physically plausible materials to it, things are going to start slowing down quite a bit, and so anything we can do now to shave even more off render times can only be a good thing. Let's open up the render settings dialog then and come into the indirect lighting tab, where we can take a look at the controls Mental Ray uses for handling both final gather and photon maps inside their respective map rollouts. Now currently and by default in Maya, these options are set up so that the two GI engines will completely recalculate their solutions from scratch each and every time the render button is hit. Inside each of the map rollouts, however, you can see that we do indeed have other options available to us. For photons, we have the ability to disable the rebuild option, and for final gather, we actually get 3 rebuild options: on, off and freeze. With both sets of options left at rebuild for now, let's set things up so that Mental Ray actually saves photon and final gather map files at render time. All that is required is to enter a file name in each of the name fields. This lets Mental Ray know that we now want to write GI map files to our current project structure. For the photon map then, let's call this 03_09_PH map, making certain to hit enter once done. And then for the final gather map, we can call this 03_09_FG map, and again hit enter to lock that setting in place. Now all we need to do is hit the render button and Mental Ray will write the files to disk for us. As we have already generated and included the photon and final gather map files for this exercise inside the exercise files download, we can skip over the rendering part here and set things up so that Mental Ray will now make use of those files and those files only at render time. We do this for the photons by turning the rebuild option off, and we do it for final gather by setting the rebuild drop down option to freeze. With the map names in place then, if I go ahead and hit the render button again, you can see that we now go straight into the rendering phase with no GI calculations taking place at all. The final render now completes in a much reduced time frame. The brilliant thing here, of course, is that we can use this set of map files right the way through production if we like, meaning we can experiment with adding realistic materials to the geometry in the scene with a full lighting solution already calculated and in place, thereby of course massively speeding up the test renders that we will naturally be taking. One drawback to keep in mind should we do that though is the fact that Mental Ray won't be picking up any new colour information from the materials we are applying and adding that to the GI solution. For instance, if I were to add a bright red paint to this flooring, we would expect that at render time there would be lots of red colour bleed or colour bands in the environment. Whilst making use of pre-calculated GI maps taken from the scene as we see it here, however, that wouldn't actually happen. Once all our materials are in place then, we will probably want to go ahead and recalculate the GI solution, tweaking both it and our scene materials in order to get an appropriate final rendered result. Time now then to move on to our next chapter, where we will start to look at some of the powerful material options that Mental Ray brings to the table, with a particular focus on the extremely powerful and versatile MIA Material X shader. mentalray's MIA Material X is a monolithic material shader designed to help render artists create most, if not all, hard surface material types when rendering with mentalray. It can also be used to create quite a number of softer or more organic substances such as rubber, foliage and fabrics, to name just a few. Now, whilst we will, throughout the course of this chapter, be making an effort to become familiar with the MIA material's major features, I would like in this particular video to touch on the subject of workflow and take note of some of the slightly less obvious features that the material offers to us. Now, I suppose the very first thing we need to understand about the MIA material is that it is in fact a physically accurate, energy conserving, high dynamic range shader, which means that there are certain best practices that we will perhaps want to adopt into our workflows in order to really get the best out of it. The most basic of which would be to always model our scenes to accurate, real-world scales. As the MIA material has been designed to reflect light energy in a physically correct way, the more accurate our scene scale, the more natural that light reflection will look in our renders. In fact, when rendering with mentalray, it is good to keep in mind that this simple construction principle can actually help out in all sorts of areas. It is also good to keep in mind that as the shader deals with incoming and outgoing light energy in accordance with the laws of thermodynamics, the more physically accurate the energy output coming from our light sources, the more predictable and pleasing our rendered results will be. At the very least, we would want, wherever possible that is, to make use of lights that have accurate energy decay or fall-off rates applied to them, quadratic being the physically accurate choice for minor lights. Applying just these two basic principles to our typical day-to-day work will cause us to find working with the MIA material a much more profitable and much more enjoyable experience than would perhaps otherwise be the case. Now, in terms of features, the MIA material has a wide range of controls that make creating diffuse, reflective and refractive surfaces not only pretty straightforward, but also highly configurable. And as we move through this chapter, we will be working with these particular control sets more closely. For now though, let's, as we say, familiarise ourselves with some of the less obvious, but no less powerful features that the MIA material makes available. For instance, if I just open up the ambient occlusion rollout, here we have the ability to either generate or augment contact and proximity shadows in our scene. The distance value, which controls how far into the scene the shader will look in order to find objects that should be considered as occluders, and the samples parameter, which essentially controls the smoothness or noise level in this fake shadow effect, will both need to be tweaked on a per material basis, with to be taken into account as we set values here. In the advanced reflection and advanced refraction rollouts, we have the use max distance controls that give us the ability to set both the amount and coloration of reflections and refractions as seen on the inside or internal volume of objects. We also, down in the advanced rollout, find one extremely important and yet little mentioned option, this being the somewhat vaguely named specular balance control. This option balances the intensity of specular or fake highlights in the material as contrasted with the intensity of actual or true reflections taken from the surrounding environment. With the value here set to 1.0, the two intensities are equal. If a lower value is set, the intensity of the specular highlights as compared to scene reflections are dialed down, whereas going in the opposite direction, so values above 1, will actually intensify the specular highlight, causing it to appear stronger than the genuine reflections. If we find then that our materials are suffering from unnaturally hot or bright spots in a render, we may want to try either reducing or even disabling the fake specular aspect of the material by setting the value here to 0. Having taken a look then at some of the less obvious and yet still very powerful options found on the MIA material, time to move on and in our next exercise start to work with the material in earnest and add some diffuse colour to the geometry pieces in our scene. Given that the MIA material is, as already noted, capable of reproducing all sorts of surface properties and material types for us, it seems only sensible to start with the basics and focus first of all on adding just diffuse or colour properties to our scene objects, and then as we progress throughout the chapter we can add further realism to the scene by adding reflective and refractive materials as well. To get started then, let's come to the window menu and open up the Hypershade editor for ourselves. First thing we will want to do is grab a new MIA material with which to work, so let's, from the Mental Ray Materials section, click to add a new MIA Material X shader to our work area. This immediately opens up our material options over in the attribute editor, meaning we can straight away come across and give our material a name. MIA_material_shelves should work just fine. As I know exactly where in the scene this material is going to be assigned, I can, in the viewport, make certain that my 3 shelf objects are selected, and then in Hypershade, right-click on the material and choose the Assign Material to Selection option. As I'm wanting to work with just the colour component of my objects for now, I'm going to set this material up so that it renders us a pretty much matte surface by reselecting it in the Hypershade window, coming into the reflection rollout, and there setting the reflection slider to a value of 0. In the diffuse rollout, you can see that we have 3 basic options for handling the distribution or diffusion of incoming light energy, these being the colour, weight and of course roughness controls. A diffuse weight of 1 means that our material will currently reflect the maximum amount of available light energy. As this is an energy conserving material, the actual diffuse colour chosen, as well as the reflection and refraction parameters, can all affect how much diffuse light will ultimately be reflected. For the most part, unless we have a very specific reason not to, this parameter can be left at its default of 1. The roughness value, as the tooltip says, provides us with a means of simulating the type of microscopic breakup on a surface that can cause light to scatter in a non-uniform manner. Similar in principle to the way in which the reflection glossiness control works, only this option of course affects only the colour component of our material. The colour option gives us the ability to assign either a solid colour or indeed a map type in order to control the diffuse colour property of the material. As in this particular instance, we're looking to produce a somewhat photographic look to our render. We're going to want to use a colour map that captures all of the nuance and variation in surface colour that can typically be found in most wood types. The quickest and most satisfactory way of doing this, of course, is to make use of an actual photograph. To load a bitmap then, let's click on the checkered square next to the diffuse colour option, and from the Create Render Node window, add a File node. Then, from the current project's source images folder, we can load the kitchen_cupboardwood_diffuse.jpg file. As we have our viewport option set to textured, we instantly see the map show up as it is applied. Now of course, one thing we do need to mention here is that the shelf geometry we are working with has had specific UVW map coordinates applied in order to give us the look that we are seeing. We are going to add just a little bit more to the material before we go ahead and take a render by first of all applying a bump map to it. To set that up, let's come down to the materials bump rollout. In the standard bump slot, add another file node, and this time from inside the file tab, make use of the kitchen_cupboardwood_reflection.jpg image. To set the overall bump strength, let's access the colour balance rollout and set the alpha gain value to 0.35. Finally, let's enable ambient occlusion for the shelf material to help generate clearer contact shadows. We can do this by reselecting the shelf geometry, opening up the material's ambient occlusion rollout, and then after enabling the ambient occlusion option, setting the distance value of about 5 centimeters or so. We can now go ahead and take a test render in order to see what we have created. Now do bear in mind that our scene here is set up to make use of pre-calculated GI solutions that at the time of creation had the default grey material applied to the shelf geometry. This means we will be losing the colour bleed or bounce that would naturally be coming from our diffuse map. With our diffuse colour and bump map options taken care of then, let's move on and take a look at how we go about creating refractive surfaces with the MIA material, specifically a physically accurate clear glass. Glass is one of those material types that most of us come into contact with on pretty much a daily basis in one form or another. The chances then that we will want or need to recreate glass objects on a rendering project are probably quite high. Now compared to older Maya material shaders such as the Blinn, Phong and Lambert options, Mental Ray's MIA material really does make creating a whole range of realistic glass types a pretty quick, simple and painless task, as we will hopefully demonstrate here. As we did with our shelf material then, let's make a start by opening up the Hypershade window and clicking to create a new MIA Material X for ourselves. Then, over in the attribute editor, we can give the new material a name, so MIA_material_glass, and in the viewport, select all of the champagne glass geometry, and then right-click on our material in order to use the Assign Material to Selection option. Now, bearing in mind that the MIA material, as we have said, is an energy-conserving material type, glass, when set up correctly, is one of those instances in which the diffuse or colour properties of the material will really make little or no difference at all to the final rendered result. Even when creating coloured glass, it isn't the diffuse controls that provide the colour information. The diffuse options handle only surface light interaction, whereas the coloration we see in a glass object comes typically from the accumulation of colour information inside the volume. That having been said though, I do typically, when creating glass, like to set my diffuse colour swatch to black just as a visual cue should I find myself glancing over the material setup. Now of course, when creating glass using the MIA material, we could go ahead and make use of the templates found in the presets flyout. In here we have, as you can see, several glass types including thick, thin, solid and frosted, along with a version entitled Glass Physical. Now, as I'm sure that you don't need me to show you how to apply presets to geometry, we are instead going to create our glass from scratch using the parameters found in the Materials UI. Now, this approach of course has the added bonus of leaving us completely clear as to which parameters in the material have been altered, which frustratingly isn't always the case when we make use of the various presets. Let's go ahead then and set up the reflectivity for our material by coming to the reflection rollout and setting the reflectivity level to a value of 1. After which we can add some refraction to the mix by coming to the refraction rollout and there setting the transparency value to 1. Two changes of course that instantly show up in our material preview. Now obviously in an energy saving material we simply cannot have a completely reflective and a completely refractive or transparent setup. Light cannot 100% bounce off and at the same time 100% pass through an object, which is why the MIA material has these BRDF or bidirectional reflection distribution function controls. These determine how much reflection can be seen in a material at a given viewing angle. With full transparency enabled, they also control how much reflection versus refraction can be seen in the material, again dependent on the viewing angle. To control this process in as physically accurate a manner as possible, we will probably want to switch from using a custom and so controllable reflectivity curve to one that instead uses an IOR or index of refraction value. Typical glass IOR values go from 1.5 on what we might think of as standard glass to about 1.7 on a heavy flint glass. Let's enable the Use Fresnel Reflections option then, and back in the refraction controls, set an IOR value of 1.5. One final tweak we will probably want to make here is to go ahead and disable the specular or fake highlight on the material in order to make certain that what we are seeing in our renders are true and so accurate scene reflections. We do this by coming to the Advanced rollout and there setting the specular balance control to a value of 0. As a final render clearly shows, we do indeed, with just a few quick parameter tweaks, now have a pretty decent looking glass material, meaning we can now move on and in our next exercise make a start at creating some highly reflective metal, something along the lines of a chrome or stainless steel. In this exercise we're going to take a look at setting up a highly reflective chrome-like metal using, of course, the Mental Ray MIA Material X controls. To start, let's, as we have done a couple of times now, open up the Hypershade editor, click to create a new MIA Material X, and then over in the attribute editor, name it MIA_material_metal. We will then want to select the bowl geometry sitting on our shelf, and again use the Assign Material to Selection command. Now whilst, as was the case with the glass material in our previous exercise, the diffuse colour controls here won't be adding any actual colour as such to our metal material, they will, unlike glass, definitely have an effect on its final look. To to avoid any unwanted darkening of our metal material by the diffuse colour property, then let's make certain that the colour value is set to white. As a really pure and expensive chrome would sit pretty close as far as the eye was concerned to completely reflective, let's for now set our reflection value, found in the reflections rollout, to 1.0. Now, whilst this value means that we can theoretically have a 100% reflective material, it will ultimately be the settings found in the BRDF section that determine whether this is in fact the case or not. Indeed, at this moment in time, the defaults are set up so that we will see only 20% reflectivity on the 0 degree or camera facing portion of an object, with that ramping up to 100% as geometry faces turn away from the camera and reach the 90 degree or right angle threshold. For a more chrome-like appearance, we will actually want our camera facing or 0 degree reflection levels to be much higher than they currently are. Of course, a value of 1 would mean that all incoming light energy was being reflected by this material, giving us completely glossy or mirror-like reflections. For a little more realism though, I think we will dial things back just a little and settle for a 0 degree setting of 0.9. We could also, as an alternative approach, enable the Use Fresnel Reflections option and use an IOR setting of about 15 in order to achieve much the same effect. The only difference here being that instead of almost completely reflective 90 degree faces, we get something probably a little more physically correct. In this instance though, we're going to stick with using our custom reflectivity curve. With those changes made then, let's take a render and see what we have. Now, a caution worth mentioning here is the fact that reflective materials are of course only as good as the environment in which they are sitting. If we for instance have our object sitting in a completely black void with nothing for the materials to reflect, well, chances are that things aren't going to look terribly interesting. Keep in mind that we do in this scene have geometry, a built environment if you like, that is helping our reflections look a little more believable. One useful piece of functionality to be aware of in the MIA material controls is the fact that we can make use of maps, both procedural and bitmap, in order to control the reflectivity levels for our material. If I just click on the map button and then from the Create Render Node browser select Checker Map, you can see as I take a render that what we get now is essentially an on-off pattern in our reflections. This is because if we look in the Checker Maps colour section, the colour swatches are set to black and white. So where we have white, we get 100% or completely on reflections. These areas will make use of the general reflectivity settings being used in the material, whereas in the black areas, we get no reflectivity at all. Keep in mind, of course, that we are only seeing white in the non-reflective areas because this is the diffuse colour our material has been set to. If this was something like a bright pink, then pink would be the colour showing up in these non-reflective areas. One extremely powerful way of using this functionality would be to have varying shades of grey in a reflection control map. This would of course add variation and believability to the way our reflections behave. Reflectivity in the MIA material then is easy to both set up and control, especially so when almost purely reflective materials are involved. Moving on to our next exercise then, we're going to have a little change of scenery and take a look at how we can use MIA material functionality to create a translucent looking fabric. In this exercise, we're having a bit of a change in scenery in order to demonstrate how the MIA material can be used to create thin surface objects that appear to behave fairly realistically when rendered in direct light. Indeed, the method we will look at here can be used to create materials that are more organic in nature, such as both fabric and foliage, to name just two. To accomplish this, we're going to be using the MIA material's translucency feature. To see how things currently stand with our tablecloth material, let's take a render of the scene. What we have, as you can see, is a fairly decent looking surface material with this bright checkered pattern standing out quite nicely. Clearly though, in this particular camera view, we are looking almost directly into the sun, and yet we're not really seeing any kind of light penetration through what is clearly a fairly thin tablecloth fabric. This is the effect we're going to work at creating here. And so, first of all, let's graph the shader network for our MIA tablecloth material. Next, we want to click on the Create Render Node button for the refraction colour, and then, after clearing any selections already found in the browser list, type the word 2 in the filter field and select the MIB two-sided map that shows up there. We will need to make some changes to the colour values here, as we will be using this map to control transparency levels on our tablecloth geometry. As we want no change to the outward or front facing polygons, we can set the front colour option here to black. Then, in order to create a translucency effect on the inside or back facing polygons, we can set the back colour to a grayscale value. 0.5 should work well for us here. Next, so as to avoid any unnecessary slowdowns in our render, we can set the material's index of refraction value to 1.0, so the same as air, essentially giving us no refraction at all. We can then set transparency to 1 or fully on. As we want translucency here, we will need to enable the translucency option in the rollout of the same name, set the weight value to 1.0 so that we get just translucency, and then by means of a middle mouse drag and drop operation, pipe our diffuse map, so file node 5, into the translucency colour option of the material, just so that it knows what the lightened or bright translucency colours ought to be. With that done, we can save what we have and take another render. What we get now is a very obvious brightening on the inside of our tablecloth material. If we want a subtler translucency effect, all we need to do is set the back colour on our two-sided map to a somewhat darker grayscale value. One thing to be aware of with regard to the effect that we have created here is that this really is just a material trick. This setup won't affect lighting and shadows in the scene in any way, and so if we wanted to create the look of extra light penetration under our tables, we really would need to add extra lighting or perhaps light bounce cards under there. That having been said though, what we have accomplished here in a very short space of time using just the MIA material and the MIB two-sided map is not a bad little effect. Of course, we could have used more complex materials to do this, such as one of the subsurface scattering options. As those materials can be quite time-consuming to set up and configure, however, using the translucency option on the MIA material to create thin surface effects such as paper, foliage or fabric can oftentimes make an awful lot of sense. Over the next couple of videos in this chapter, we will take a look at a mental ray material that has been provided in order to deal with a very specific hard surface texturing task, that of recreating the sometimes extremely complex colour and reflectivity properties of both modern and older vehicle finishes. The material is of course the mental ray car paint phenomenon. To begin our look at this specialised material, let's open up the Hypershade editor and then click to add a new MI Car Paint Phenomenon X to the work area. Straight away we can also select the body geometry for our lead car in the viewport, use the Assign Material to Selection command, and then go ahead and rename the material, calling it mi_car_paint_lead car. With that in place then, let's go ahead and take a render. What we see straight out of the box, as it were, is that our defaults produce a very nice, highly reflective showroom quality vehicle finish. Of course, the beauty of this particular material is that pretty much every aspect of the finish we see here is available to be customised by the rendering artist. Indeed, the one thing that pretty much everybody seems to love to do with the car paint material is create a more metallic looking paint job by adding reflective flakes to it. In fact, as we look at the controls over in the attribute editor, we can see that we do indeed have a whole rollout dedicated to